If you walk into the produce section of any grocery store, you'll find a large selection dedicated to bananas. The store's size, location, or the time of year doesn't matter. You'll find them. Bananas are the world's most widely consumed fruit, and the fourth most important food crop by some measures. But it wasn't always this way. While bananas have long been a staple in areas near the equator, its rise from a distinctly tropical food to a global commodity is a relatively recent phenomena, a first-of-its-kind product of 19th century capitalism and technological breakthroughs. And it came at a steep price to the laborers who grew it, the nations where they were planted, and potentially the banana's own long-term survival. Hello, welcome to Second-Hand History. The banana's domestication goes back at least 7,000 years when farmers in Papua New Guinea began to cultivate its wild ancestors. These early bananas were smaller than the fruit we know today and full of unpleasant seeds. However, farmers hybridized these crops with related species and selectively cultivated the ones with the most fruit and the fewest seeds, until eventually they produced a mutant that was entirely seedless. Normally, this would be an evolutionary dead end, but banana plants can reproduce asexually if you cut off and replant parts of the stem. Farmers loved it. The details are hazy, but the following millennia saw banana cultivation spread all across the tropics of the Old World, from southern China to sub-Saharan Africa. To complete matters, the Portuguese and Spanish introduced bananas to their New World empires in the 16th century. But even as bananas spread across the tropics, they remained at best a rare luxury in temperate regions, where the plant struggles to grow. Few in those regions had even seen one. But technology and market forces began to change that in the late 19th century. The invention of refrigerated rail cars and transport ships allowed fresh produce to be shipped at distances once impossible, while rising middle-class wealth and growing concerns about health saw an increased demand for that produce. Bananas lent themselves well to this niche. They continued to ripen after being picked, giving ships more time to carry them. They're quite cheap to grow in bulk. And last but not least, the plants bear fruit year-round. After bananas gained commercial attention in the US when a plant was brought to its 1876 Centennial Exposition, a trade network emerged connecting small banana plantations in Central America with wholesale importers in the US. Then, in 1889, two key players in the trade, Boston Fruit and Tropical Trading and Transport, merged to create a new entity, the United Fruit Company. It was an inflection point. Not only did their combined forces dwarf all of their competition, forming a quote-unquote horizontal monopoly, but for the first time in the industry, a single company controlled its entire supply chain, creating a quote-unquote vertical monopoly too. It owned the plantations that grew its bananas, the refrigerated cargo ships that transported them, and the wholesale distribution hubs in the United States and later Europe that sold them. This allowed United Fruit to rake in massive profits, which it reinvested not only in more banana plantations, but in promotional material touting the supposed benefits of this new yellow fruit. U.S. banana imports more than doubled between 1900 and 1913, and United Fruit controlled roughly 3/4 of that trade. But the United Fruit Company's commercial empire wasn't built solely on providing a good product at low cost. There was a darker side, and fair warning, this really gets dark. Massive swaths of rainforest were cut down to make way for vast monoculture plantations. On those plantations, workers performed back-breaking labor for little pay, and that pay often wasn't in cash, but in vouchers only usable at company stores. Spies reported labor organizers and other quote-unquote troublemakers to overseers. If they were lucky, they were merely blacklisted, but the company was not above violence. In 1928, workers in Colombia went on strike, demanding cash pay and other basic benefits. United Fruit refused to negotiate and instead called in the army. Machine gunners gave the strikers 5 minutes to disperse, and then opened fire. No one knows how many people died that day, but sources range from several dozen to 2,000. United Fruit's abuses did not stop at its workers. While the company promoted itself as a benevolent force uplifting quote-unquote backwards nations, locals gave it a more ominous nickname, El Pulpo, or the octopus. The company bought and bullied its way into one Central American country after another, accruing massive political power. When a rival firm set up shop in Panama and Costa Rica, United Fruit had the Costa Rican army seize its plantations. When Honduras's pro-company strongman was ousted in 1910, the company's business partners facilitated a counter-coup to reinstate him the following year. Just to be clear, recent scholarship has emphasized that United Fruit's power was not absolute. Laborers found ways to exercise leverage, even if that just meant voting with their feet, and as late as the 1930s, the company actually bought a fraction of its bananas from independent growers. But it still had much more power than any corporation should, and the most infamous incident came in 1950s Guatemala, where the company owned 40% of the arable land. Much of it was uncultivated, partly held as reserve, and partly just to deny it to potential competition. In 1952, Guatemala's democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, expropriated the unused land to give to landless peasants. He offered the company compensation at the land's declared tax value, but United Fruit couldn't let this stand. This was the Cold War, and the company had its buddies in the White House and US media convince Americans that Arbenz, a devoted admirer of Franklin Roosevelt, was actually a communist secretly working with the Soviet Union. It worked, at least well enough for a nation already gripped by anti-communist paranoia. In 1954, a US-backed coup ousted Arbenz and installed a business-friendly military dictatorship, a regime whose brutal suppression of perceived leftists would eventually culminate in the genocide of Guatemala's native Maya population. Ironically, the coup contributed to the beginning of the end of El Pulpo's reign. Far from crushing communist undercurrents, Arbenz's ouster radicalized Latin American leftists. As it reckoned with the fallout, the US gradually began to view the United Fruit Company as a diplomatic liability. However, this was just one of several interlinked factors in the company's decline. Natural disasters, local unrest, resurgent competition, and long-delayed government antitrust actions all took their toll in the coming decades. United Fruit fell into debt and was forced to sell off much of its empire. It rebranded and reorganized to no avail, and in 1975, company president Eli Black had had enough. Faced with business failures and imminent exposure for bribing Honduran officials, he broke a window in his high-rise office and jumped to his death. United Fruit survives today as Chiquita Brands International, a shadow of its old self, but the banana trade it helped pioneer lives on. The US and Europe still import most of their bananas from plantations in the Caribbean and Central America, but the biggest producers now are China and India, and their bananas are for internal consumption. But intrigue surrounding the fruit is far from over. In fact, bananas face their biggest threat yet. The same factors that made the banana such an appealing crop since ancient times, its asexual reproduction and lack of seeds, also meant that many variants have almost no genetic diversity. When combined with modern monoculture plantations, the result is an epidemiological tinderbox. This is not a hypothetical risk. For much of the 20th century, the primary export banana was a variety called Gros Michel, prized for its sweetness and tough skin. But in the 1950s, a fungal blight called Panama disease wiped it out almost completely. Growers switched to the variety familiar to Western consumers today, the Cavendish, but now it too is in danger. Banana growing companies and countries have turned to gene splicing and hybridization with wild bananas to try and head off the threat, but any new varieties will only be the next step in a larger biological arms race with no certain outcome. Banana lovers, stay tuned.
This video feels more like a top-down story about United Fruit specifically. Where's everyone else?
Well, they were the biggest player in the trade until recently, so why wouldn't they be the star?
From a Western perspective, maybe. But even there, simply being the biggest or strongest no longer entitles you to be history's main character. For the last 50 years, scholars have moved away from top-down narratives to focus more on ordinary people, like the workers or consumers. What makes their side of the story less important than the bosses?
But how would that even replace the traditional style of history? You can't ask what life was like for a United Fruit worker if you don't know what United Fruit is.
That is true, but it has to be a balance. No more just focusing on the top. Doing this has given us new insights on the lives of ordinary people and challenged old narratives as overly simplistic. Where did United Fruit's workers eat and sleep? What did they feel about their jobs? Were they entirely helpless like older sources depicted? Or did they have their own ways of pushing back?
Fine, whatever. Well, what do you think? Let us know your thoughts down below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and hope to see you next time.